Come up closer.
So we'll be serving together.
Shall I? Good morning, friends, and welcome to Grace St. Luke's Episcopal Church in Memphis, Tennessee. My name is Ollie Rencher, and I'm so delighted to welcome Tim Huebner, our guest today, and we thank you for joining us online. This is an opportunity for us to reflect on faith and citizenship, and Tim, in his devotion to this work, has taken us to a deeper place already. Tim is a fellow Episcopalian, member at Calvary Church, and has been a friend to Grace St. Luke's for many years, and is a personal friend to me, and I give thanks for him. So we welcome him in just a moment after prayer. 1 week from today, to begin the season of Advent, we will have a time of Advent wreath making here in Treasman Hall in this very space. So you're invited to come at 9:30, and there will be all the supplies you need. If you'd like to bring your own shears or clippers, bring those along as well. And then after the 10:30 service, another opportunity to make Advent wreaths to observe the season in that way in your home. But before we begin, let us pray. Gracious God, we give you thanks and praise for the gift of this particular day, this last Sunday after Pentecost, the Sunday of Christ the King, Sunday before the season of Advent. We give thanks for the ministry of Tim Huebner to your church and to the world. Be with us as we engage this time of formation, of learning, of growth, and understanding what it means to be fully realized into your dream on earth as it is in heaven. Amen. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you, Ollie. Is everyone able to hear me? Is my microphone working well? Well enough? A little louder? Great. Well, it is a pleasure to be here with all of you at Grace St. Luke's Episcopal Church. Thanks for having me back for session 2 of a two-part sort of series on faith and citizenship. And we're trying to deal with two big issues, two huge issues. And trust me when I say that I understand how complex these are, and I know that we're not going to resolve them in 2 30-minute sessions. But I do hope that these sessions will help us to think about these two issues. And the issues are, first of all, how can we transcend and transform how people of faith have historically understood their relationship to America? So how can we sort of change some of the history that I outlined last time? And second, how can we do so especially in our own polarized age, when people are so set against each other when it comes to our sort of broader civic life? So I want us to think about those two big questions. And for those of you who were not here last week, or if you've not seen last week's presentation, which I understand is available online, let me just offer a brief summary. So last week we basically focused on 4 themes in American history when it comes to how people of faith have understood America. And we started with the Puritans back in the 17th century, who had a very sort of deeply held sense of mission, that they thought that they had a sort of providential mission to come to North America in the early 17th century. And it's from that sense of providential mission that we get this idea from Scripture, but obviously cited by Winthrop and others, of the Puritans as a sort of shining city on a hill. And then as we move forward into the 18th century, we focused on how a number of different groups that were part of the 18th century American colonies helped to bring about a sense of religious, or at least Christian, diversity. And emerging out of that came a sense of toleration that led to religious liberty, which was then written into the U.S. Constitution of 1787. Third, we talked about the fact that sense of freedom to express one's faith actually led to the flourishing of evangelical faith, especially in the early 19th century, with an emphasis on personal religious belief. And we especially focused on the rise of the Methodists and the Baptists and Presbyterians during that period. And then finally, we talked about the sense of empire that emerged once all of those groups started to be dominant and they started to influence politics and public sort of policy and sort of thinking on a whole range of issues from slavery to war. What we see by the 1840s and 1850s is a sense of empire, religious Christian empire in the post-1846 American political order. It's in 1846, of course, that the United States wages war with Mexico from 1846 to 1848. And so we sort of summarized what we finished up last time with this image, right? This image of American progress. This is from the 1870s, and this especially seems to capture this notion of an empire, right? This whole idea that 19th century Christians really believed that they were bringing civilization into the western part of the United States as they moved into those areas. And so we see in this image a figure here of American progress who has in her hands the sort of wires for the telegraph. We see the railroads expanding into the west. Off in the distance, we can see a city, and there are ships, and there's a bridge. And there's the sense that sort of progress is now moving here from east to west. We see settlers in their wagons, and we see Native Americans here being pushed off further into the west as progress, Christian progress, and that's how they understood it in the 1840s and into the 1870s, as that whole notion of empire has certainly taken hold. So that's sort of where we left off last time. we talked about then, obviously, the fact that there was a downside or a sort of dark side to all of this, and it's a pro-slavery argument as well as an argument to sort of justify moving Native peoples off of the land. And so we sort of finished up last time with this question: how can we transcend? How can we transform? How can we reshape some of these ways that people of faith have understood America? So that's where I want to pick up here today. And I offered just a hint at the end of class last time as to how we might actually do that. And we'll get to that in just a second. But first I want to turn to one of my favorite authors, Brian Mclaren, who puts it this way. This is a challenging question for us right now in the early 21st century. And it is, in light of all of this history, right, he asks, could Christian faith lose the bitter taste of colonialism, exclusion, judgment, hypocrisy, and oppression, and regain the sweet and nourishing flavor of justice, joy, and peace? So, could we lose all of that? That bitter taste of colonialism, exclusion, judgment, the hypocrisy associated with justifying slavery with Bible verses? Is there a way to move past all of that into a different understanding of Christian faith that focuses on justice, joy, and peace? And of course, I think, and Brian Mclaren thinks, that the answer to that question is yes. We can do that. The reason that I say that we can do that is because in some ways our history shows that we already have done it. At certain moments, on certain issues, people of faith have been able to mobilize in support of reform and justice. And I mentioned this last time, that in the early 19th century, even in the midst of all of that rhetoric about empire and pro-slavery, especially in the southern states, there were Northerners, evangelicals, Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, who were the foundation of the abolitionist movement to end slavery. And their efforts mattered, as we know, in that slavery ended in 1865 after the end of the Civil War. We also know that people of faith played a significant role in social sort of justice movements in the early 20th century in helping to bring about all sorts of new public policies to help the poor and to help those who had to work long hours for very low wages. All of those efforts in the early 20th century to establish sort of public health and safety measures and minimum wages, maximum hour laws, many of those early 20th century public policies were shaped by people of faith. And finally, most especially in the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s, we know that it was a religious movement that emerged out of the black church in the 1950s, and that it was joined by some whites who were people of faith. People like Will Campbell from Mississippi, who was a Baptist from the South, but who understood a sort of notion of justice. People like Jonathan Daniel from the North, who was an Episcopal seminary student who came down into Alabama in the 1960s and literally was shot and gave his life for the cause of justice and civil rights. So we know that in our history, people of faith have been able to bring about social change. And we see it especially and most recently in the civil rights movement. So I think that the answer is yes. And I would argue that people of faith can transcend and transform all of this history if they are able to heed the biblical call to justice. And this is what Brian Mclaren is talking about. A faith that focuses on justice. We know that justice is woven throughout our scriptures. I'm giving you here just 2 verses. There are many. There are many. But I want to highlight these 2 from Psalm 82 and from Micah 6:8. Give justice to the poor and the orphan. Uphold the rights of the oppressed and the destitute. Or probably much more well-known, Micah 6:8. What does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God? And I would argue that people of faith are at their best. The church is at its best when it focuses on this biblical call to justice. When we foreground these words, these claims. Now, I'm not telling you anything that you don't already know, okay? Because this is central to our faith as Episcopalians. It is actually part of our baptismal covenant, right? We know this. We've said these words. We've heard them said. We have, how many times have we joined in these words over the years? Will you seek and serve Christ in all persons, loving your neighbor as yourself? I will with God's help. Will you seek and serve Christ in all persons, loving your neighbor as yourself? I will with God's help. And this one, will you strive for justice and peace among all people and respect the dignity of every human being? I will with God's help. Respect the respect the dignity of every human being and strive for justice and peace. So again, I would argue that that's when the church is at its best. And this is a formula or a way of thinking about how we can transform and transcend some of that ugly history that I was focusing on last time. All of that history of pro-slavery, all of that history of trying to justify forcing people off of land and waging a war against Native people in the West for about 3 decades after the Civil War. We can move past that history if we focus on the biblical call to justice and our baptismal covenant. Now, this is really important, I would say. And it stands at the center of the presentation here today. It's literally right in the middle. Okay? We're at the midpoint. It's the hinge on which this presentation actually turns. In that, I think this is the answer to the first question, right, of how we can transcend this history. I also think this is the answer to the second question, which is, how do we live as faithful people in a polarized political environment? What I mean by that is not everyone is going to agree with us. We're going to have to deal with that, right? So let me go back to this slide from last time. We live in a racially and ethnically diverse society. We live in a religiously pluralistic society. We live in an increasingly secular society. And, as I said, we're living in a polarized time. Okay? So part of what we're talking about is how we can try to transform our society by focusing on the biblical call to justice, but also how we can deal especially with polarization. Okay, because in my understanding of the biblical call to justice, I'm going to have strongly held views on certain issues. And there's no guarantee, sort of given all of this, that everyone is going to agree with what I think, right? So let me give you an example, all right? And this is going to take me into this first point. I do not believe in capital punishment, all right? So let me just say that. I don't believe in capital punishment. I also know, because I looked it up last night, that about 60% of Americans do support capital punishment. So I'm part of a minority. 60% of Americans do believe in it, right? So people are going to disagree with me. Now, I think I'm following the biblical call to justice, and we can talk about this later if you'd like. I don't want this to be a presentation all about capital punishment. It's not, okay? But folks will disagree with me, all right? I want us to think about how those disagreements can and should be dealt with, okay? Because there will be disagreements based on your interactions with others. And I want to start off with this first point, which sounds obvious, but it's really important. Disagreement is normal and healthy. Okay? It's okay for people to disagree. It's almost as if we've gotten to a point in this country where we can't disagree at all without fighting. Okay? But we should start really from this premise. And I understand it. I want everyone to understand that it is normal and healthy for people to disagree. We would never want to live in a world where everyone agreed on everything. That's not the world we live in. That's not reality, nor is it what we want, right? So we have to first understand that we will disagree. Like I said, 60% of the population happens to disagree with me on something that matters a great deal to me, right? But here is the problem. According to Arthur Brooks, whom I'm going to cite here in just a few moments, the problem is not in disagreement. That's normal and healthy. The problem is with our culture of contempt. And this is where we are, I think, in the early 21st century. Contempt, which is a mixture of anger and disgust for those who disagree with us, is not healthy. Being contemptuous toward those who disagree with us, looking down on them, thinking that they're stupid, thinking that other people, this is where we go back to the baptismal covenant, thinking that other people don't have worth because they disagree with us. That's contempt, and that's a problem. And I think this is where we are. We can turn on cable news, we can go to social media, and how much sarcasm, sneering, hostile humor, and eye-rolling do we see there? A lot. Understand, folks, there is a whole industry focused on keeping you outraged. There's big money in outrage. No doubt about it. A lot of advertising dollars are focused on cable news outlets trying to get people all worked up on all sorts of issues. Okay? And a lot of this is part of that. I would say that feeds this culture of contempt. This is a term that I take from a fellow by the name of Arthur Brooks, who says that's the problem right now. So as we finish up here, I want us to think about how we can deal with polarization. And from Arthur Brooks's book, which is called Love Your Enemies, okay, which is a great title, by the way, the words of Jesus, right? Love your enemies. I want to take 5 ideas from Brooks's book, and these are woven throughout. Okay, and I'm sort of summarizing things that are in this book. But I want us to just kind of talk about each of these. And first, might be the most important. recognize that contempt for someone else is never justified. If you are a person of faith, it goes back to the baptismal covenant. If you really believe in the dignity of every human being, if you really believe that you have to see Christ in others, you are not going to treat someone else with contempt, even if you really disagree with them on an issue that's really important to you. All right? That's a really good starting point. Even if we don't get anywhere else down this list, that's a really good place to start. Second, I would say do not attack or insult. And Arthur Brooks says, don't even try to win if you're in an argument. Actually, he says we should try to disagree better by engaging in a healthy exchange of ideas. There's all sorts of social science evidence that by trying to win an argument, actually what you do to the other person that you're talking with is you cause them to dig in their heels. I mean, you're not going to change anyone's mind if you're trying to win an argument and show them evidence as to why you're right and they're wrong. It just doesn't work that way. So try to engage in a healthy exchange of ideas by focusing on the other person's distress with empathy. Why is it that this matters so much to them? Why do they feel this way? Where is this coming from? How long have they felt this way? I want to understand what it is that you're saying so that I can understand better why we actually disagree. And understanding that other person's point of view before offering your own is a helpful way of actually disagreeing. 4, and I found this very useful lately. I mean, I'm obsessed with news and politics and policy and history. I read and absorb and watch TV and listen, and I've got the radio on, there's podcasts, there's everything, right? Sometimes it's actually healthy to disconnect from all of that. I've stopped listening to the radio in the morning on the way to work. I need that time maybe to be quiet and to not, get myself excited about whatever I've just heard on the news. Maybe that's not the best way to start off the day. And it'll be different for all of you, okay? But sometimes it's helpful to disconnect and to be silent or to think about other things. Politics is not everything, right? It's not everything. It's not the most important thing. And I think we've lost sight of that. All right, so sometimes it's good to turn off the TV. Sometimes it's good to have some quiet. Sometimes it's actually better to read than it is to be bombarded with someone else trying to get you outraged or excited about something. All right. And finally, and this might be the hardest one of all right? Like this is really taking it far, right? Go where people disagree with you and learn from them. That is tough. That takes an active step on your part so that you would have to be saying, all right, I know these people in this place, in this situation, in this setting, wherever it is, are going to disagree with me about, whatever it is. But I'm going to go there anyway, and I'm going to listen. I'm going to talk. Look, this is hard work, right? I don't want this to sound glib or easy. I understand that this is not easy. Okay? And this is certainly the hardest item on this list. But I do think ultimately that's where we have to end up. Like if we're willing and able to do some of these things, eventually we're going to have to seek people out who disagree with us and learn from them. All right. We're headed into the questions now, right? Okay, so how would we summarize these things? As I said, I really think heeding the call to justice is when people of faith are at their best. That's how we can transcend that difficult, that ugly history that we were focusing on last time. If we focus on the call to justice, we will show compassion. And that's how we can help to transform our society, right? And healing the division in our society and promoting a sense of reconciliation, we can do that. But we have to be willing to shun this culture of contempt that I've been talking about. And finally, I would say that living the baptismal covenant is the key here. It's what actually unites both of these practices. Because it's okay to disagree with somebody, but if we show contempt for them based on what they believe, we're not living our baptismal covenant. We're not actually willing to respect the dignity of every human being if we're showing contempt. All right? I think this is the key. This, as I said, it's the center of the presentation. It's the heart of how we solve or how we start to think about solving both of these big issues, right? All right, so let me just finish up, then we'll go into questions. 3 books that I recommend, especially on heeding the biblical call to justice. You can't do better than Just Mercy by Brian Stevens. I don't know whether you've read the book, but it's moving and it's powerful. It was made into a movie. If you haven't seen the movie, if you haven't read the book, you should read it. It will transform how you think about America and our understanding of justice and how there's still a lot of injustice in our society, even in the early 21st century. And Brian Stevenson does an excellent job of showing that through the justice system, all the problems and issues that we're still dealing with in this country, even now. Second, I strongly recommend Brian Mclaren, The Great Spiritual Migration, where he's asking us to rethink what it means to be Christian in our day and time. Asking us to think about that sort of generous faith focused on justice that we have been focusing on here. And then finally, as I said, Arthur Brooks, Love Your Enemies, How Decent People Can Save America from the Culture of Contempt. So these are 3 books that I recommend to you. And with that, I'll open it up for questions, comments, dialogue. I think we have, how much time do we have? A little time. So the floor is yours. And I think there's a microphone.
With the first point that you mentioned from Arthur Brooks's book, I think, at least for me, contempt has sort of become a pretty quick and natural response to a lot of the things that we hear in society. Any suggestions for how you retrain yourself to turn off that gut reaction?
It's a great question. I hope that this talk, this opportunity to think about this is a first step. But I also hope that, you've already taken some steps, right? Because you said the baptismal covenant, because you come here on Sundays, because you hear the word preached, and because you should be thinking about how to live your faith in our society, that I think that the groundwork is there, right? So the foundation is there. And I think it's always true that we just have to learn how to access that. And, as I said, we will disagree with other people, but it's very different to disagree with somebody and to sort of view them in this very contemptuous way, which is not healthy at all. So I think that the foundations are there for all of us. We just need to remind ourselves of the words of this covenant, and we need to tap into this, spiritual power that all of us have to actually ask for strength from God to do this work. I mean, it's not easy. There's no doubt about it. This is not easy work, right? But I think we can do it. What else?
These aren't really questions, but observations. These aren't really questions, but observations. 2 weeks ago, David Waters gave a presentation here, and he talked about being a news junkie, which is not surprising. And he talked about weaning himself from all these unproductive debates. Mm-hmm. And one of the things he said, which picks up on what you're talking about, Tim, is he quoted a line from Ted Lasso, which is a TV show.
Yep.
Okay? And he said, don't judge, be curious. And in the process of that, which leads into your comments, is so many times I think we get hung up on our positions, our beliefs, we're right and they're wrong kind of, that we lose sight of what is really important is building the relationship. And that there is something, and it goes back to our baptismal covenant, there is something beyond us that is more important than what is factually there right in front of us. And we can call that spirituality. We can call it building relationships.
Right.
We can call it faith. But take nationalism. People are at their best when they are fighting for a purpose greater than themselves. And if we can make the baptismal covenant,
right,
or the kingdom of God, if you will,
right,
be what we're fighting for, then it's gonna be outside of ourselves, outside of our ego. And we will do a much better job.
Excellent point. Thank you for saying all that. And I think maybe that also helps to respond to the first question, because focusing on the relationship and the dignity of that person and sort of Christ in that person is so important. And understanding that if you can build that personal relationship based on what you have in common, and based on the fact that you should be looking at that person as a child of God, I think that can also be one of the steps that we're talking about to avoid viewing others with contempt, as we've talked about before. So yeah, I think that's an excellent point. Trying to build personal relationships is what life is all about, and it's certainly what the spiritual life is all about. Absolutely. Thank you for that. What else?
Okay, sorry, apologies if I'm kind of thinking out loud when I'm saying it. I think I'm absorbing and appreciating everything you're saying, and I'm questioning how evolved on some of these things. Because I think I struggle a little bit with the concept, not necessarily that people disagree, of course that they do, but the underlying kind of tone that everyone's position is equally valid, which may not at all be what you're saying. And I think I do have a hard time with people I know or people I don't, whether that's social media or political conversations, political elections, things like that, where I don't know, like a recent example, and this is random, it's just top of mind, but like this Briarcrest controversy the other day where, Briarcrest hosted this, forum on a biblical response to gender identity. And the invitation itself was like, when your child's trying to come out as gay, or they're trying to pick their own gender, and we're going to be telling you how to have the proper response that basically puts those idiots in their places. And that kind of attitude, and that, again, that's just a recent topical thing that happened in the ether in this community, but like, it's hard for me to listen to things like that and approach and be like, wow, these children of God just have a different but equally valid perspective, when I think that is not, in fact, a valid perspective. And so that's just a microcosmic example, but things like that seem to happen all the time when racism, homophobia, xenophobia, you name it, seems to be the compelling motivation behind someone else's things. That is difficult for me to know how to process and approach with this kind of energy.
Thank you for saying all that. And I mean, as I said at the outset, look, you know, I do not have all the answers, and these are big, complex problems. And I am certainly not arguing that all perspectives are equally valid. I'm not, I mean, this is not a presentation in support of kind of a loose relativistic view of the world. Every point of view is equally valid, and we just have to deal with that. I think you can hold on to your principles, okay? And I also think that at the same time that you hold on to your principles, you can have an open mind about honestly engaging with another person and being able to listen to them without changing or sacrificing those things that you believe are part of the biblical sort of call of justice. So I'm not saying that we need to compromise our principles. I think that we need to have very deeply held values, that we need to understand what those values are, why we hold them. I'm all for people, you know, reading, praying, you know, trying to do all that they can to understand their own view of the world. But I also think that what should come with that is an understanding that even someone who disagrees with me is still a child of God. And I think that's, I think that is a moral absolute also. And so we have to deal with that. And maybe we just need to live in that tension, that I really firmly believe in this, okay, whatever it is. And this other person really, really disagrees with me. But that person is a child of God. And I don't like how they answer these questions or how they talk about these things that mean a lot, but I still have to respect them as a child of God. And I still have to respect their dignity as a human being. And if I'm able, and like I said, it's really hard, like as you get further down this list, this gets really hard. Okay? If I'm able to actually engage in a dialogue actively and to seek out those that I disagree with, it doesn't mean that my own views are necessarily going to change if those are fundamental beliefs. But the only way to overcome a culture of contempt is to get out of our silos or our echo chambers or whatever you want to call them and engage with others, understanding that we're probably not going to change their minds and they're probably not going to change ours. And that's okay. But I think we can disagree better than we are right now, if that helps. It's a hard question. I mean, you've gotten to the heart of the matter. What else? Have we got time for one more?
See, that was an interesting comment, because he was talking about interaction. That was an interesting point. But it was not an individual that she was really addressing. It was an institution. And, you know, there's a certain herd mentality when a group gets together that you're not going to make any headway. You're not going to, you may learn, you can listen to their point of view. But
the kind of things that you're talking about are really engagement with a person, an individual, at a one-on-one level. When you get into organizations, it becomes more political.
Right.
And it has all sorts of other parts to that.
Right.
Make it very difficult to engage like you're describing here.
Right. Excellent point. And I think this work is so big and so important and so complicated that that we could say this exists at the institutional level and it's systemic, or we could say it's not going to be resolved. But I also think at the individual level, that's the only way to change the systems and the structures and the institutions. Okay, because all I can do in my daily life, all I can do is love the person who's right in front of me in whatever situation it is. And I might even seek out folks that I know that I'm going to disagree with so that I can actually try to do this work. But I can't change those institutions as an individual. All I can do in my daily life, in my interactions with individuals, is to do what we're talking about here. And I think that's important work. And those are the first steps. I know these are huge problems. I know that they're political, they're policy oriented, they have to do with, huge lobbying organizations, Washington, D.C., and K Street and everything else. But our lives matter, and how we live our lives every day matters. And I think what we can do at the individual level can make a difference. And I don't ever want to say that what we do in our individual daily lives doesn't matter or it doesn't make a difference, because I don't believe that. We can make a difference. All right, I think we're out of time.
So friends, thank you again for being here today, and please join me in giving thanks to Tim Huebner. It's incredible to think about what Tim has asked us to consider, and I love the way you ended your presentation. And obviously here in the life of the church, this happens to be Christ the King Sunday. And so we're reflecting on who is our King. Like, who truly is our King is the whole foundation of this day. And so if we take and heed, using your word, what we say we believe about love and about justice, we're on the right path. So thank you.